We will call the Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations and Related Programs to order. Thank everyone for being here. And before we begin, I want to take a moment to congratulate our new full committee chairman, Chairman Tom Cole. He is a tremendous leader and cares deeply about the issues in the State Foreign Operations Bill. Again, we could not be the full committee could not be in better hands. I'm also extremely pleased to welcome our newest subcommittee member, because I know there are other subcommittees meeting at the same time, Mr. Juan Ciscomani from Arizona. I actually pleaded and begged and scratched and pulled to try to get him on this subcommittee. He's going to be a great addition to this subcommittee. And so, again, I'm thrilled to work with Juan Ciscomani on this subcommittee. Minister of Power, again, welcome back. Thank you for being here. We're pleased to have you with us this afternoon for the subcommittee's first budget hearing of the year. I want to start by thanking you and also the men and women of USAID for the hard work and service to our country. We do not take that for granted. These are difficult times, and their commitment, the folks that work with you to duty, is noted and greatly appreciated by this committee, by every member of this committee. The fiscal year 2025 budget request for the U.S. Agency for International Development represents a slight increase from the FY24 enacted levels for the USAID managed accounts. The recently enacted fiscal year 24 State Foreign Operations Bill, I think, takes an important step towards right-sizing the foreign assistance budget in the wake of reckless spending of the last number of years. I encourage this administration, and frankly, the many advocates working in this space, to think and change the narrative. The question should no longer be how much money can we get, but how do we utilize the resources that we do have more strategically and more effectively? For example, Madam Administrator, when you evaluate your programs, I obviously assume that you don't just determine whether they are working based on how much funding goes out the door. Instead, I guess, or at least obviously I would hope, that you look at whether the investments change things for the better and meet the goals and the objectives that have been established, that have been set. And likewise, we can't simply discuss the growing needs globally and expect to meet those challenges based solely on the amount of dollars provided for the response. I am committed, working with you, to define, the strategic priorities and create solutions to make our aid more effective. I think anything less is a disservice to the American taxpayer, to our own national security interests, and those that we're actually trying to help. It's also well past time for our partners and our allies to step up. The United States cannot continue to carry an outsized share of donor funding for global challenges. So today I'm interested in hearing about what the administration is doing to plan strategically with traditional and non-traditional donors to meet critical needs around the world. In light of all this, I will reiterate what I said at your hearing last year, Administrator. We need to get back to basics, to what we know that works. Because funding and promoting polarizing and politically charged programs will frankly only mean additional cuts to the state foreign operations top line in future years. That's just a statement of fact. Those kind of things jeopardize support from Congress, from the American public, and notably even from our foreign partners, especially when funding is tight. So instead, proven investments in areas with broad bipartisan support is where I think you should focus on making important advances for global development. And so as important as to the what is the who. I support your efforts to find local solutions through local partners, and also your efforts to increase private sector engagement. I am, however, concerned by the heavy reliance on the United Nations in carrying out USAID programs. Many UN organizations have shown their true stripes since the horrific attacks by Hamas on Israel 6 months ago. For decades, they turned a blind eye and actually, frankly, enabled Hamas to turn hospitals into dens of terror, brainwashed kids to hate Jews, and used innocent civilians as human shields in their war against Israel. But then, when Israel responded to October 7th, that deep-seated anti-Semitism at the UN was unfortunately on display for the entire world to see. Almost every single UN leader, with the exception of the executive director of the WFP, has spread disinformation attacking Israel, including messages originating from Hamas. The UN Humanitarian Coordinator thinks Hamas, and has said so, with Hamas's gruesome and inhumane track record is merely a political movement. UNICEF and the World Health Organization continue their blood libel while saying Israel is targeting hospitals and aid workers. Thankfully, the fiscal year 24 appropriation bills prohibits fund to UNRWA, a first step in making it a thing of the past. The bill also requires analysis and reporting from every UN and international organization funded in the bill on addressing the rampant anti-Israel bias and anti-Semitism. And here's the sad part. Well, another of the sad parts. There are so many qualified organizations to partner around the world with, from small local organizations, faith-based groups, to large international non-governmental organizations. So the notion that the UN organizations are uniquely qualified is frankly just not true. It's a farce. And I really hope that you will work to expand your partner base in all sectors and regions. I have many topics to address. We do have many topics to address, and I will in my questions, but I want to leave plenty of time. In closing, let me once again thank you. Thank you for being here today to testify on the administration's fiscal year 25 budget request for USAID. I also want to thank you for always being accessible to me. And now I yield to the ranking member of the subcommittee, Congresswoman Lee, for her opening remarks. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Madam Administrator. First, let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and for yielding. You know, one of the reasons that I truly value serving on this subcommittee is that even though we disagree on a variety of issues, we're friends and we understand each other's point of views very clearly, and thank you for that. I also get a chance to serve with colleagues who, like myself, know that in addition to being an American, we are also citizens of the world and want to put in the work to tackle the big challenges that we face together. I recently, Madam Administrator, was in Ghana, Nigeria. I spent Easter Sunday in Chad, in the refugee camps right on the Sudanese border. People, as you know, are facing violence. Women are being raped. The refugee influx into Chad is mounting. And so hopefully, people are facing starvation. Hopefully, in addition to providing for the dire humanitarian needs that I know you all and USAID is providing, and have to ramp it up, I hope that we can also look at the underlying issues and help forge a peace process that leads to helping to end this war. Also, make no mistake that many of these challenges are immense, as you know, an eruption of violence and war, not only in the Middle East, not only on the continent of Africa, but throughout the world. Efforts by dictators to roll back human rights and undermine democracies, violation of international borders, proliferation of weapons, including nuclear weapons, famines and pandemics, man-made climate change that's destroying crops, lives, and in the case of some island states, entire countries. And thank goodness that you're leading this effort to address many of these challenges around the world. But yes, they can't be solved by one nation, as our chairman said. They require teamwork, they require alliances, and they require true partnerships. And when I travel abroad, just as I did week before last, I often meet with people who are leading on these issues in their home countries. And let me tell you, and I think you know this, they want to partner with the United States. In fact, many of them would prefer to partner with the United States rather than Russia or China. And they're asking tough questions, though, about the United States as a partner. They're asking whether we are truly committed to sticking with them and willing to invest the funds and resources necessary to truly address these problems. They're also asking us to take their views and their priorities seriously, as true partners do. If you look at the fiscal 24 budget that we passed a few weeks ago and where this Congress is headed, I fear that many people around the world are losing faith in us as a partner. 20 years after we started first talking about the three-legged stools of our national security, diplomacy, development, and defense, we're no closer to bringing balance to this stool. In fact, we have never been so lopsided. The resources that we spend on defense dwarf the resources that we spend on our presence overseas, the pursuit of American interests, and our most basic partnerships to build a better and a safer world. Our military leaders, they get it. Famously, General Mathis told Congress a decade ago, if you don't fully fund the State Department, then I have to buy more ammunitions. But no matter how many times our own military leaders say it, successive Congresses have refused to make the civilian investments needed to take the pressure off of military action. In fact, in the most recent appropriations cycle, diplomacy and development were cut by 6%, while the Pentagon budget was increased by $7 billion. And the Pentagon just flunked its 6th audit. Waste, fraud, and abuse is rampant. We let the military contractors and weapons and arms dealers get away with this with no accountability. We can't keep going on like this. If we're truly serious about confronting these challenges, then it must be reflected in our budget. Without sufficient development funding, we face a future stuck in cycles of crises that require more and more humanitarian interventions and even military interventions and result in a less stable world. Now, we know that our colleagues want us to invest more in diplomacy and development. I've seen the requests that members make each and every year. For fiscal 2024, members of the House submitted more than 7,000 individual requests just for this bill, 7,000. Those members have done so and continue to do so because they know that these investments are crucial for humanitarian values, for peace, and for security. So, Administrative Power, you've dedicated your life to this mission of advocating for governments to prioritize basic human dignity. And I'm really proud that you're there at USAID, leading an institution and workforce who are just as selflessly dedicated to this mission. And we need to be sure that the administration and the president are making the case in the budget as they should. So I look forward to partnering with you, with Chairman Diaz-Balart, with our ranking member, and with our chairman of the Appropriations Committee to make the case for why this bill needs to invest more this year and in future years to serve America, the American people, and the world. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Actually, before I yield now to the distinguished ranking member of the full committee, I do want to, I mentioned that we have a new addition to the subcommittee, Mr. Subcommittee. Before you got here, I actually said some nice things about you, but I'm not going to repeat them, so you're going to have to look up in the record. So, welcome.
Well, thank you, sir. I almost flipped over in my chair here, so I found that there was some hazing going on here on the new guy. Or maybe I just don't know how to handle the chair. Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I will now, it's a privilege to yield to the full committee ranking member, again, the full committee of appropriations, Ms. DeLauro, for her opening statements.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Lee, for holding this hearing. And I want to say a special thank you to our witness, Administrator Power. I've said this for 2 days in a row, and I want to say it because I think it applies here as well. I said it with Secretary Cardona, Secretary Mayorkas, Shirley Chisholm, the first woman to serve in the African-American woman to serve in the House of Representatives, said that public service is the rent you pay for space on this earth. And I want to just say a thank you for paying that rent over and over and over again. We are so grateful for your strong leadership at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, for your vigorous advocacy on behalf of the world's most vulnerable people. And to the staff at your agency, you are doing heroic work. And please, I hope that you will share our gratitude with your staff for the work and the efforts that they engage in. Your stewardship of USAID has improved lives around the world. Grateful for all that you have done to make the case for greater humanitarian aid in what is a time of extraordinary need. And today's hearing is about the budget request for fiscal year 2025. But I want to take this opportunity to underscore the dire need for this Congress to provide supplemental humanitarian aid. Innocent families are in danger. Children are starving. Civilian casualties are mounting in conflict zones all around the world. Earlier this year, I visited Israel, where, along with several of our House colleagues, I had the opportunity to meet with both Israeli and Palestinian Authority leadership. We visited the border with Gaza, the site of the massacre at the music festival, met with families of the Israeli hostages and Palestinian victims of settler violence. We cannot abandon the innocent civilians and humanitarian aid workers caught in the crossfire of this conflict. The costs of Hamas's rule over Gaza and war against Israel are borne by innocent Palestinians. Israel's harsh response to the October 7th attack and indiscriminate bombing campaign has raised these costs further. Families and children are facing unthinkable circumstances, millions facing famine because of this conflict. No one with clear eyes would say otherwise. And we cannot sit on the sideline and watch people starve in this world, in Gaza or elsewhere. In Gaza, this is why I've called for an immediate ceasefire of at least 6 weeks to enable the delivery of aid to civilians in Gaza. We must protect aid workers, open additional crossings to bring in at least 500 trucks a day, and ensure that food cannot be used as a weapon of war. And it's not just about Gaza. The humanitarian support requested by the administration would make sure we are not leaving Ukrainians or the Sudanese, the Haitians, the Rohingya behind. The world needs strong American leadership through supporting our allies' security and especially through humanitarian assistance. Stability around the world is quickly deteriorating because of an absence of American support. An absence caused by pointless and cynical politicking here in Washington, D.C. We simply cannot choose to sit by and watch as millions around the world starve. Failing to address hunger and malnutrition will have generational effects. In a global economy, a global society, hunger abroad has a direct impact on us at home. We cannot retreat from the world stage under the guise of putting, quote, America first. We put America first by demonstrating the power of American leadership, that we have the strength and the resolve and the heart to fight for the most vulnerable people, protect their freedom, and preserve their dignity. The America that I know does not look away while millions starve. It sends critical supplies like ready-to-use therapeutic foods, RUTFs, which is a product that brings 95% of wasted children back from the brink of death in just a matter of weeks. The America that I know does not turn a blind eye to the indiscriminate killing of civilians either. Yes, we must use our diplomatic and our defense tools to resolve conflicts, but we must also use our humanitarian and development resources to help the children and families who did not ask for conflict, who did not ask to be driven out of their homes, and who are fighting for their countries. We must get this done. Our allies and our adversaries are watching, and we must be unwavering in our purpose. And without a supplemental funding package, USAID will be forced to further dip into its annual funding resources, which in fact cannot deal with the dire needs that must be met around the world. While I continue to press congressional leadership to move quickly on this desperately needed humanitarian aid, I'm pleased to see that President Biden's budget for fiscal year 2025 provides the agency with moderate increases for humanitarian, global health, climate, nutrition, and accountable governance programs. Countering fentanyl, combating hunger, and reaffirming the U.S. as a global health leader are all critical missions undertaken by USAID. I look forward to discussing your efforts in these areas and others during this hearing. We must continue to ensure that USAID has the funding necessary to support the world's most vulnerable individuals, while reestablishing American leadership on a global stage. And I will just say this, you cannot do more as you are doing with less. We need to continue to ensure robust funding for the work that you have been tasked to do. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the distinguished ranking member of the full committee. Madam Administrator, your full statement will be placed in the record. Again, thanks for being here. Please feel free to summarize your testimony, and now you're recognized. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Lee. I also would like to recognize the newly elected chairman, Tom Cole, and grateful Ranking Member DeLauro for you being here and for your leadership and your strong words. I look forward to working with all the distinguished members of the committee on a set of really complex, hard challenges that we are facing as a nation and that the world is facing beyond our borders in a manner that has ramifications back home. I'd just like to start by situating us in the lobby of the Republic of Korea's development agency, which is their equivalent of USAID. There, they display an old bag of flour from the 1940s, which is marked with the words, "From the American people," which of course is what is also USAID's insignia to this day. This is a reminder of how the United States supported them when they were one of the poorest countries on the planet. Today, South Korea is one of the world's richest nations, and last year, South Korea spent $4 billion providing aid to other nations. This year, they plan to spend nearly $5 billion. The decades that the United States has supported countries in charting their own paths of development have brought extraordinary results for our partners and for our own people. We've helped stop the spread of diseases that threaten us all. We have developed more resilient, high-yield crops that can feed growing populations. We've helped people rise from poverty, and in doing so, invested billions in American small businesses, opening up new markets to American products. 8 of America's top 10 trading partners were once recipients of U.S. assistance, 8 of 10. Under President Biden's leadership and in partnership with this committee, we are building on that remarkable legacy. In Ukraine, USAID has partnered with farmers, helping those farmers withstand some of the most brutal attacks that we have seen. Putin's attempted to destroy the economy, and one of the best ways to destroy the economy is to destroy the agricultural sector. But thanks to you all and the generosity of the American people, we have been able to get farmers the seeds, the equipment, help them build the alternative export routes, help them stay on their feet before the Black Sea. One of the Black Sea routes was reopened. All of this together has ensured that really miraculously, Ukraine has helped rebound its grain exports now to nearly pre-war levels. And some months, its agricultural exports actually exceed what they were doing before February 2022. As a result of that, of course, global food prices are now down 26% from their 2022 peak. So much that happens in the world, again, has consequences back here, and we are grateful for the support that we've gotten to address some of the most destabilizing events of our time. In Nigeria, we are providing community health workers with X-ray and portable technologies to spot diseases like TB early. This technology can be carried in a backpack to rural communities, and so far it has helped increase TB diagnoses by 1/3 in a single year. So patients can get treatment, and critically, outbreaks then won't spread across the planet. Across Africa, we are working to connect African and American companies and reduce barriers to trade through the Prosper Africa initiative. Efforts since 2019 have generated some $86 billion in trade and investment. Again, building prosperity there, to be sure, but also for American businesses here at home. Bipartisan support for these efforts makes Americans safer and more prosperous and provides a critical foundation for U.S. leadership at just the time other global powers are working aggressively to erode U.S. alliances and undermine basic rights and freedom. For example, the PRC's global lending spree, with which you all are familiar, has made it now the world's largest debt collector. For every dollar of aid that the PRC provides to low-income and middle-income countries, the PRC has provided $9, roughly, in debt. The opposite is true of the United States. For every dollar of debt we provide at least $9 of assistance. The PRC's assistance, also in contrast to ours, tends to be negotiated behind closed doors, which fuels corruption and can demonstrate a flagrant disregard for human rights. Some of you are familiar with the Safe Cities initiative, whereby surveillance and facial recognition technology has been provided by the PRC to more than 80 countries. This technology, of course, can be used to monitor critics, journalists, and activists. We need American leadership to advance models of development and governance that honor freedom and transparency and opportunity. The Biden-Harris administration's FY 2025 request of $28.3 billion for USAID's fully and partially managed accounts give us the resources to continue this leadership. With these funds, we will help nations around the world strengthen food security, improve health, and drive economic growth. We will also respond to historic levels of humanitarian need. USAID teams have been working day and night to address the catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Gaza, where nearly the entire population is living under the threat of famine. Add to that the ongoing crises in Ukraine, Sudan, and beyond, and the continued battering from a growing number of natural disasters. And this is a statistic just worth pausing on. The number of people requiring humanitarian assistance has increased by nearly a third, from 274 million in 2022 to 363 million at the end of 2023. That is the steepest incline I can recall in my lifetime. To meet these needs, we will need both the $10 billion in this budget request, as well as the $10 billion in emergency humanitarian assistance in the pending national security supplemental request. Otherwise, we will be forced to make draconian cuts to rations to vulnerable people all around the world. I want to be clear, though, that we are responsible stewards of taxpayer resources, and we believe in the importance of leveraging what the taxpayer provides us with to do more. The FY 2025 request recognizes the need for trade-offs, even as these global needs are escalating. The budget gives us specific resources to help us deliver even better value for money. Since we inaugurated our new Office of the Chief Economist last July, this team is already expanding our use of rigorous analysis across the agency to identify the programs with the highest impact per dollar invested so that they can be scaled. For instance, they identified a poverty reduction program our Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance is piloting in Uganda. This offers a sequenced set of supports like training and financial services that help refugees move from being reliant on humanitarian assistance to earning sustainable livelihoods for themselves. For every dollar we invest, households are seeing over 4 times the return in economic benefits. And we are now taking that program, scaling it to other nations. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your support for the Office of Chief Economist and this cost-effectiveness analysis that we are trying to mainstream across our programming. Beyond maximizing our own resources, we are drawing in new partners through innovative new tools, again, that we thank you for supporting, like our new EDGE Fund, which is an incentive fund designed to apply the private sector's unique edge to some of the largest global development challenges. We're working with companies like Citibank, Walmart, Johnson & Johnson to boost our impact and drive progress beyond our narrow programs. And here, I would just cite one statistic before closing that we're very proud of, which is that between from FY 21 to 23 alone, private sector partner contributions to USAID activities jumped by over 60%. So I just want to reinforce how determined we are to leverage what you give us to bring in resources from others. We need to continue to drive this progress. We need to invest to do so in a workforce that is becoming more nimble and more empowered to pursue truly catalytic change. If we do make these investments, I have no doubt that we can continue America's extraordinary legacy of leadership in building a more prosperous and secure world for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Administrator. Members, I will call on members based on seniority, as always, as we always do, seniority of those present when the hearing is called to order, and alternating from side to side. Each member will have 5 minutes for both question and answer. And hopefully we'll have more than one round. And so, Administrator, I assume you're up to date on what is transpiring in Venezuela, including the disqualification of both Maria Corina Machado and then the standing candidate who Machado designated in her place. And so knowing of the fact that the opposition has been disqualified from running, what redeemable value is left in this exercise? It's obviously not an election that's about to take place in July. Shouldn't we be able to say at this moment that, based on the facts, what has transpired, that this by definition is not a free and fair process?
Well, certainly, we share your concern that the coming elections are already falling far short of anything resembling international standards. I guess the only, and you are very, very familiar with the situation on the ground there and the exclusion, intimidation, arrest of opposition leaders. I think the element that we are grappling with together is that the Venezuelan people, of course, want elections, have long wanted elections, and leaders from across the political spectrum have decided to participate, and they are preparing for and participating, viewing it as the best way to show just, again, how much discontent there is with the conditions and with the leadership by
But
Maduro.
again, the main opposition candidates have now been rejected from participating. So I just want to make sure that, we have to know some of the basic things. Would you agree with me that that is no longer a free election,
Well,
free and fair election?
I guess I don't ever feel, and maybe this is a character flaw, that we have the luxury of giving up on pushing.
No, I know that. We have to keep
For-
pushing, but do you foresee that election as being a free and fair election?
Like I
That's
said,
not-
I think we see the same facts on the ground and have grave concerns, just as you have. I think we are seeking still, give you an example, the recent statements by progressive leaders, let's call them, in the hemisphere, and the pressure that they are exerting on the Venezuelan regime is something that we haven't heard in the ways that we have sought for some time. That's a new element. Our engagements with opposition politicians, they are still fighting on the ground to try to organize, to try to put forward some candidate that can stand on behalf of democratic aspirations. So we're just still in the scrum, trying to be supportive for those
No, I get
elements who
that.
want democracy.
I get that.
So I
but-
don't
but-
want to
but that-
prejudge where we'll get.
Well, except for the fact that that people are pushing, and as you are, and the United States is, and others are pushing for elections, doesn't negate the fact that the main opposition folks are not allowed to participate in the election. Because here's my point of that. Why are we going to be spending taxpayer funds on observing what is in essence a farce? I should note that those funds are pending before the committee as we speak. So, Administrator, I'm going to need some assurances, because it seems to me that spending taxpayer money on something that we can try to use diplomatic talk all we want is a farce, is not exactly potentially the best use of taxpayer funding. So I need some reassurances as to what are we looking at doing here? I mean, so we all aspire, and we all want to continue to pressure and push for free and democratic elections in Venezuela. I don't think anybody could ever believe that those elections, as they're going to take place now, are free and fair. I mean, I don't think anybody doubts that they're not. Precisely, you're saying folks are pushing for it to happen, but they're not. So again, I need some reassurances, because spending taxpayer money on just kind of like a farce is the kind of thing that I think the American people have issues with.
I mean, maybe we could just take offline this discussion. I have seen other parts of the world, when the United States declares an election, when the United States government declares an election unfree or unfair, it gets one reaction. When we're able to bring in independent, non-governmental monitors who make that assessment, it actually has more credibility, including in the kinds of circles, again, that we are seeking to enlist in putting more pressure on Maduro, since clearly, again, we are not seeing the pressure that we are imposing producing the desired results.
Well, I look forward to continuing working with you, but as you can see,
I've
I've got
point
some
well
serious
taken.
concerns.
Yeah.
All right, let me just go
you.
one more question, and then we'll then we'll move on. The SFOPS bill for fiscal year '24 directed you to work with the Secretary of State to certify and report to the appropriate congressional committees that oversight policies and procedures have been established and are in use to prevent the diversion of humanitarian assistance in Gaza to Hamas or other terrorists, and the misuse or destruction of such assistance. And obviously, we can't afford to repeat the mistakes of the past. Let me be perfectly clear. Entities that you plan to fund cannot be allowed to turn a blind eye to the use of its facilities for Hamas terrorist actions, divert our assistance to Hamas or Hamas's interests, or allow its employees to participate in Hamas terrorist activities and attacks against Israel. We've been very clear about that. Because of that's by the way, because of all those things and more, that's what was taking place in UNRWA. You know, principals, teachers, counselors at UNRWA schools are known Hamas militants, and Israelis have been warning the UN about this for years, falling on deaf ears. And we're not talking about a handful of bad apples. We're talking about systematic rot throughout the entire organization. I will tell you that my big surprise in all of this was to think that some are still advocating for UNRWA to carry on it has been hard for me to understand. So let me ask you this. What can you tell us and the American people about how you will ensure, as dictated in the bill, that humanitarian assistance being provided for the people of Gaza will be safeguarded from diversion to or influenced by Hamas?
Well, let me just first say that, well in advance of these new provisions, our Inspector General, USAID's Inspector General, I'm sure this is true of the State Department Inspector General and others, are all over this operating environment, its complexity, the fact that Hamas, has acted in the way that it has. I mean, the horrific terrorist nature of Hamas, but also infiltrating, it looks like, on the basis of the allegations, UNRWA. Israel has eyes on all humanitarian assistance that goes into Gaza. The government of Israel also is keeping very close watch on convoys and trucks. USAID's partners are trusted partners, one of whom you mentioned, I think, in your opening statement, World Food Program. That's our largest food provider. We work as well with UNICEF, with the International Medical Corps, with many US-based NGOs. These are trusted partners we work with all over the world. They're under an obligation to report any diversion that occurs. As you know, there have been reports of convoys where civilians charge at the convoys in order to try to seize the goods on those convoys. By and large, these are families, parents, desperate to bring food home to their families because of the degree of scarcity. But our partners report those incidents when they occur and are obliged to do so. So we will be very transparent, as we always are, with the Inspector General, and we welcome more oversight because this is obviously the most complex environment to operate in the world.
Great, and just a couple of other issues related. The 15-day requirement in the Act for certification has passed. You know what the status of the new oversight policies and procedures are, and when can Congress expect to receive the certification? Because obviously this has to be a top priority.
Yeah, I believe that this is something done jointly between the State Department and USAID, and there were a lot of different actors within the State Department who had to pull this together, and it has now come over to USAID, and we will get it back to you as soon as possible. I recognize the clock has long past ticked, I guess,
It is back,
on that.
and I just
Yeah.
want to make sure you understand it is
Yes,
a top
we were
priority.
tracking,
And
yeah.
lastly, USAID continues to use statistics provided by Hamas regarding, casualty demographics that have proven to be both mathematically flawed and frankly implausible under any wartime scenario. I think that's just legitimizing Hamas's propaganda that Israel is targeting women and children and committing genocide. All of these stats are coming from Hamas. And yet, for example, a recent USAID fund report that claims famine is imminent in Gaza is based on data coming from Hamas. which, as you know, is designated a terrorist organization for good reason. So are you concerned that by doing this, USAID is frankly undermining the credibility of the U.S. government as an honest broker and is really contributing to the anti-Israeli sentiment? Using Hamas propaganda, numbers and statements as if it was factually correct has consequences. So are you concerned about that?
Well, I'm actually really glad you raised this because I've had a number of hearings in the last day or two, and this has been alluded to, but hasn't come up as explicitly. So I'd say the following. I mean, first, I had a chance in my recent visit to Israel to engage the highest leaders, to engage the Prime Minister on Israel's own assessments of casualties. And while there is divergence from the so-called Ministry of Health's, the Ministry of Health's statistics that they have been putting out, it was not substantial. To the degree that there was divergence, it was on the question of fighting-age men and whether they were considered Hamas or not considered Hamas. But I don't think that on the Israeli side that there may be, again, there certainly are disagreements over some of the facts. But broadly speaking, in terms of casualty numbers overall, there is not much divergence. That's point one. Point two is we have been appealing for greater access for the kinds of partners that I mentioned already, to be able to move around, to be able to themselves monitor, do verification. And this is something that the IDF and the government of Israel can help ensure happens. We can get more of our longstanding international partners to be obtaining data of the kind that we can use at the very least to supplement the data that is coming in from these other sources. That has not been possible because access has been so abridged in this crisis.
And, maybe one of the potentially simplest way to at least start is just, make sure that we quote the source when we talk about Department of Health. Hamas. It is Hamas. So, that would be a good starting point. Anyways, everybody's been very kind and tolerating my time. Let me go to this distinguished rank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me go back to my opening statement. Did you want to respond?
I'm just noting that the clock doesn't seem to be working. And I have our clock, and I have a self-interest in the clock working.
We will, all right, we'll see what we can do about that. Okay, actually, and because, one of the privileges of being a chair and ranking member is that the clock works to our advantage. So.
Let's see if I can reclaim some of your time. As I mentioned, Madam Administrator, in my opening statement, we're really failing to invest adequately in our diplomacy and our development toolkits. The recently passed fiscal 2024 SFOPS bill cut development assistance and economic support funds by about 10% each. Now, how are you able to make the case for development both within the administration and publicly if, in fact, these cuts continue? What new public arguments are you making to build, I guess, broader public and political support? And finally, again, going to the defense budget, we increased the Pentagon spending by $27 billion last year. That's almost as big as USAID's fiscal 25 budget request, I believe roughly around $28 billion. And so what would USAID be able to do if we doubled USAID budget, making only a minor dent, mind you, minor dent? I know there's about 150 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse in the resources provided to the Defense Department, and how would this impact both U.S. security and the security of our country, allies, and partners?
Well, there's a lot in your question, and grateful for, of course, for the premise of the question. I think it was the day before yesterday, I testified by our Senate counterpart, Appropriations Subcommittee, and Senator Graham began the hearing by saying, I'm as hawkish as the next guy, but we can't kill our way out of this mess. meaning the number of crises that exist around the world, so many of them at their root lie either severe economic deprivation, evil radicalization, but that still requires reaching young people and, diverting them from the path of radicalization. We just experienced a once-in-a-century pandemic where more lab capacity, more surveillance certainly is one of the lessons we take from that something that can harm American lives can come from anywhere. And we have a great global health security initiative that you all have supported. But in the bill that just passed, we had to cut it by $200 million. And that's, I know COVID is receding, but not for those families who lost loved ones. And we just, can't know precisely where the next threat to American health is going to come from, but we can diversify our portfolio and really make investments with other countries, leveraging those investments to get other countries to do more as well. So I think, again, to your point, we need to make the case in terms of the security and the welfare of the American people. I gave some examples at the top about our economic interest as well in enhancing regulatory environments for American companies to invest, enhancing trade, fighting corruption, so more of the proceeds actually go to the people in these countries. But I do hear a lot up here rightly about geopolitical competition as well with the PRC. And you ask if we could double our budget. I mean, I would be able to meet, I think, much more of the demand signal that we are getting to be the preferred partner. We are the partner of choice. There is a ton of buyer's remorse because of the consequences of the Belt and Road Initiative in terms of debt distress. People are ready for stepped-up engagement with the United States across Asia, across sub-Saharan Africa, in our own hemisphere. But that is not something that we're not in a position to optimize our ability to take advantage of that buyer's remorse by seeing what is going to be around a 10% cut to our development assistance account this year.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. If we have a second go-around, I'll yield any time I have so that we can get to additional questions.
Yes. Ranking Member of the full committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, my deep thanks for you to be here today and for the work that you're doing on providing humanitarian aid. I mentioned in my opening remarks returning from a CODEL to Israel, Gaza, and the humanitarian need is dire. And I just might add that this was a few weeks ago. I had a conversation with Ambassador McCain, who is doing an outstanding job with World Food Program. And I asked her where we stood in Gaza on the issue of people starving, et cetera. And she said to me that she said they're going to be on the verge of famine. This is coming from Ambassador McCain of the World Food Program. Many of my colleagues have suggested that we curtail or even prevent funding for humanitarian aid to Gaza. So I have a series of questions. First, what would the consequences be if the United States stopped providing humanitarian assistance to Gaza? How much aid, in terms of aid, how much aid is getting into Gaza? So let me just ask you to quickly, if we stopped, the U.S. stopped providing humanitarian assistance to Gaza.
I mean, the already dire food situation would, by definition, get a lot worse. We have traditionally been the world's largest humanitarian donor on most crises, certainly on this one. Again, we seek to leverage what we do to get the Gulf, the Europeans and others to contribute more. And with our not funding UNRWA, it is the case that a lot of the other partners have moved to step up their funding of UNRWA as we fund, again, these other partners. But if we're not in a position to fund World Food Program, UNICEF, the commodities that UNRWA is distributing would not be flowing into Gaza. And I will just note, because, again, it's a very bleak picture, but we have this week seen the first really substantial improvements in terms of truck access. So up to this point, the limiting factor has been access and mobility inside Gaza, it would be completely heartbreaking if we finally begin to see significant improvements in access, and then the limiting factor would become resources, which is what is going to happen if the National Security Supplemental does not pass. And here, if people hear nothing else on that, because I know it's proven hard to bring the Senate version to a vote, the word supplemental in that context is a misnomer for our humanitarian assistance around the world, because the previous, and this committee knows this, subcommittee knows this well, the previous approach over the last 2 years was to move significant amounts of humanitarian assistance into supplementals. And basically, if we don't get the National Security Supplemental, given the FY24 budget that just passed, we will be looking at a 40% cut in humanitarian assistance globally, of which Gaza is just a subset, but an important subset, with a 40% increase, roughly 35 to 40% increase in global need. So that is the delta that we are looking at. What the delta translates into in human terms is a requirement that we cut people off rations, or those families that are receiving just the bare minimum to live will get roughly half or a quarter of what they're currently receiving, because we have to make the money go around as best we can.
So we would contribute to famine and starvation. You don't have to say yes or no, but that in fact would be the result. If people don't have food and they don't eat, they starve and they die. It's not a rocket science to understand. We're facing situations in Sudan and Haiti and Somalia, et cetera. I don't diminish those, but we've got some of the most engaged non-governmental agencies telling us of what is on the verge of happening. It's my understanding that there needs to be upwards of 500 trucks per day. And you mentioned that this is increasing. What is preventing us from getting more humanitarian aid into Gaza? What are the benefits of land routes versus airdrops or sea deliveries that are being explored as well here?
Well, there have been many impediments, let's put it that way, many things that have stood in the way. I think that what is imperative right now is the opening, immediate opening, really, of an additional land crossing. You asked about airdrops versus land. There's no substitute. Airdrops, if you drop a lot of MREs, they do some good for those who receive the meals ready to eat in the moment, but that's, meal ready to eat is a meal ready to eat. Whereas if we can bring in a sack of flour, you're talking about fueling bakeries who can provide bread that, that can last families for much longer. So opening the Eretz crossing, or another crossing in the north where the food shortages are the greatest. Again, the vast majority of the population lives in the south, but for those 300,000 people roughly who live in the north, it's absolutely acute conditions now when it comes to food. So getting that land crossing into the north. We're in conversations with the Jordanians and the government of Israel about significantly expanding a land corridor from Jordan, so that also you have more trucks coming in with the prioritization of food, medicine, and other commodities that have been in such short supply inside. That will help a great deal. And then, sometimes discussions of so-called deconfliction or civilian protection exist apart from discussions around humanitarian access, but they really actually belong together because it's absolutely imperative not only that humanitarian aid workers be safe to deliver those supplies that come in, but also that the civilians who would come to a distribution themselves feel safe. And we've had a number of significant civilian casualty incidents at food distribution points. Some of those casualty incidents, to be clear, are, again, what I alluded to earlier, the civilians kind of charging the convoys in order to, believing that that this is going to be the last truck they see. But some of them are, by virtue of IDF attacks, that are being investigated and so forth. But it's just really important that the safety of civilians be taken into account, even as the IDF, again, understandably, pursues this horrific terrorist group that still wants to eliminate Jewish people.
Do we have that's was my next point. Do we have safeguards in place with regard, does USAID have safeguards in place to protect NGOs who are working in Gaza? Do you have?
And by protect, you mean from?
From being killed by getting convoys in or
think
being?
USAID was at the heart of the early discussions, working closely with Ambassador Satterfield to
Yeah.
set up the initial so-called deconfliction cell.
Right.
Whereby the humanitarian organizations that we support and others provide their coordinates,
Mm-hmm.
their movements to the IDF so that the IDF knows that these are on some no-strike list. I think the challenge, and this has been acknowledged now by the government of Israel, but is that often the information that existed within the deconfliction cell or within the Israeli government wasn't making its way to commanders in the field. And that is one of the reasons that we've seen a significant number of incidents, and that's what all of us are aiming to avoid or to improve that system so that the information that the system as a whole has access to actually reaches the people who are involved in kinetic operations inside Gaza.
So that's part of the resources that you need in order to be able to deal with those safeguards, in order to, is that?
I mean, I don't know that any outside actor is going to be in a position
able
to
to
guarantee it. It's
guarantee,
really
right.
incumbent on the IDF in its engagements with humanitarian organizations to be able to offer those assurances and for those assurances to prove reliable.
Well, let me make a final comment. I thank your indulgence. I had many conversations, as I want to just try to deal with the capabilities of the NGOs. There's some view that this is maybe an easy process. You say to World Central Kitchen, you say to World Food Program, you say to Mercy Corps, you say to the others that, okay, it's now your responsibility to do this because we are removing a distribution system that has existed since 1949. Okay, so and that being UNRWA. When I spoke to each of the heads, I spoke to Jose Antras' staff, I spoke to Save the Children, I spoke to World Food Program, Ambassador McCain, spoke to Oxfam, spoke to all of the NGO, well, not all, but just the big ones, about their own capabilities, which they're great, they're doing all that they can. But quite frankly, what they said, and whether or not you have difficulty with the organization of UNRWA, which there very well may be in terms of you got people at the IDF who've now been removed, and there will be an investigation. There is a current investigation of what happened, et cetera, and that should be ongoing. We'll figure it out. But each and every one of those organizations said very clearly to me that we may be going to another form of doing this, but in the interim, in the short term, it is the only distribution system that we have to get out quantities of humanitarian assistance in the volume that it's needed to go right now to stave off hunger, starvation, and the other efforts that are engaged and involved with providing humanitarian assistance. So I just think that the complexity of this, of distributing this aid, is got to be truly understood in our country of what needs to happen. It's not slam dunk. You go away and we're going to take it over. That is not the case. And we have to understand what happens. And you're in a position to help to understand that or tell us what that complexity is so that we can do something about it as members of Congress who can't sit by, cannot sit by and watch what's happening.
I
Let me
mean,
thank the.
What are the capabilities of these groups to do what needs to get done at this moment?
I'll just be brief. I know I'm mindful of time, but what I would say is that UNRWA before October 7th. And again, I think we all, these allegations are very serious against these named individuals, and the investigation that the UN is doing, the outside investigation, are extremely important, and there are broader lessons for all of our partners to learn. But what is hard to explain, there's the complexity of the war environment, but there's the complexity that UNRWA is just unlike anything that we, and I want to stress, USA doesn't fund UNRWA, it comes out of the State Department. There are people in our government that are much more expert than I am, but it is a quasi-administration for schools, and we've had exchanges over the years about, again, the problematic textbooks and so forth. But the teachers for Palestinians in Gaza before October 7th were UNRWA teachers. The health workers were paid by UNRWA. So there was a pre-existing pool of 13,000 people, of which a significant subset, since there's very few health facilities still functional, and all the schools have either closed or are no longer operational or have been destroyed. Those people pivoted to being involved in this distribution. And so I think that's the exchange also, Mr. Chairman, in terms of what you mentioned at the beginning. For now, World Food Program, UNICEF, they have dozens of employees on the ground, not thousands. And the government of Israel even, a month ago saw it, again, understandably in light of these allegations, but came to the view that they don't want UNRWA involved in convoys. But it became impossible to do convoys to address the level of food insecurity. So now, thankfully, they have reversed that position and are now allowing UNRWA trucks and vehicles to be at least part of convoys, even though they're maintaining the position on whether UNRWA leads convoys. But this is just an example of the necessity, given the degree of urgency around food needs, to draw on the infrastructure that exists. We just don't have the luxury of having some wholesale building of an entirely new distribution system while bombs are falling and while severe acute malnutrition is is skyrocketing.
Let me again thank the distinguished ranking member, and also for being here. No, thank you. And to all of you, Administrator, I get that. UNRWA has a lot of employees. So does Hamas. And a lot of those employees are Hamas. And the concept of, if we wanted just to ignore, and that's the sad part about why the UN should have been listening and acting before October to not become a fully owned subsidiary of Hamas, and then we wouldn't be having this conversation. But let me go on to my colleagues who have been incredibly patient. Mr. Fleischman, Chairman Fleischman, thank you for your patience. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Administrator Powers, I want to thank you for appearing before the subcommittee and all of your hard work. Last year, as you may recall, I asked you how USAID planned on increasing sustainability for a $17 billion contract to distribute medicines around the world, which was a renewal of a $10 billion contract before that, which was a renewal of a series of awards going back to the 1960s. We discussed and you agreed that USAID planned on changing business as usual by working with more local partners in a more market-based and sustainable model rather than perpetuating the often disappointing legacy approaches. However, I've been disappointed to read that USAID has once again starting to issue these contracts to the same set of legacy Washington, D.C. based aid contractors. My first question is, what is your strategy, and can you assure this committee that USAID actually plans on doing things differently with respect to these awards and changing the development model to include more market-based, sustainable local partners? Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for sticking with this and with us. We have set targets to channel our assistance to local partners to try to get to 25% by 2025. We are going to fall short of that target. There are many barriers that I'd welcome the chance to follow up on offline. In terms of contracting officers, we have far fewer contracting officers than, for example, DOD, which I may have said in the exchange last year, forgive me, I don't remember. I think we have gotten to the place where we're now at about slightly higher than 10% of our assistance more broadly. Where we are lagging, as your question underscores, is in bulk procurement. I think we have a long way to go there. Again, one of the reasons that having an insufficient number of contracting officers matters is, doing these smaller grants or contracts, eats up the bandwidth of these stretched contracting officers. So I think if we can build out that core, we'll be in a position to be more versatile. But it is the case, this is something that is important, which is that we are now working with more local partners than we ever have in our history. And the work with USAID.gov website, which was meant to bring in untraditional partners, including small business, as well as local organizations in the countries in which we work, has about 4,000 people who have signed in and created partner profiles. We are working through that. I think 70 to 80% of those who have signed up via work with USAID.gov are new partners. So we have the pool, but on the big commodity procurement, which you're focused on, we have some work to do.
Thank you. Our government support for Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, is critical to advancing our global maternal and child health and pandemic preparedness and response goals. Over the past 2 decades, Gavi has achieved a remarkable record of success. At the same time, Gavi has played a role in promoting global health security. I'm pleased to see that USAID continue to advance development of health innovations through the new 2023 through 2028 Global Health R&D strategy, given that we are still missing critical drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics to tackle health challenges like tuberculosis, HIV, and malaria. As you know, 2024 is a replenishment year for Gavi, and it will convene its broad network of donors this summer to commit to the next 5-year program funding cycle. U.S. support for Gavi has always played a key role in marshaling commitments from Gavi's other donors, and this replenishment cycle will be no different. My question, please, is can you give us a sense of how the Biden administration is approaching the Gavi replenishment from other donors? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, again, your commitment to Gavi reflects, I think, the bipartisanship that has always accompanied these replenishment cycles. We hope that persists into this cycle. The budget request before you includes $300 million for Gavi. That's a $10 million increase over that, which was appropriated in FY 2023. And, we think that signals the longstanding commitment that we have had. A lot of what we do for Gavi is also development diplomacy. I'm, again, trying to shift our way of doing things into both attention to our programs, attention to our contracting, and the diversity of our partner base, as we discussed, but also recognizing that the calls we make to other countries, the way we leverage, for example, this $300 million, will have as much to do with how much Gavi has, more, in fact, than as our own commitment. But Gavi is an investment in American security, health security as well, and I think that's what our generosity toward Gavi reflects, is both generosity, but also enlightened self-interest in terms of American health.
Thank you for your answers, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank
Thank you,
you,
Congressman.
Chairman Fleischman. My distinguished colleague from Florida. Ms. Frankel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Administrator Power. So good to have you. I'm over here. Hello. Mr. Chair, I would like to remind folks that the suffering in Gaza is a result of Hamas's terrorist attack on Israel, brutal terrorist attack. And I want to remind folks, too, that there is still so much suffering in Israel. And Hamas leaders have clearly said that this is just a start. So I want to say very clearly that Hamas must release the hostages. They should stand down, which is questionable that they will. And obviously allow humanitarian assistance to flow, and hopefully all parties will cooperate with that. But I want to say, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker. Oh, I try to make you Speaker. Mr. Chairman, that Israel needs, yeah, Israel needs a time and space to defend itself. And and I do hope that we can come together and pass the Ukraine and Israel budget that will allow that to happen, and that it must include humanitarian support. I wanted to ask Administrative Power, again, I'm a grandmother, so the thought of children starving any place is very disturbing to me. And I think you said this, there is famine all over the world. Can you quantify that? And like, with examples of countries? I think,
Well,
Yeah.
again,
Yes.
I'm very deferential here to the experts. There's
Yeah.
a committee of experts that looks at this, and there's a set of, maybe if you're interested, sort of the technical requirements around the percentage of children who are malnourished, the number of families, percentage of families facing severe food insecurity. I think the places that we are most alert to the risk of food insecurity and food scarcity causing large-scale loss of life and suffering would be Sudan right now and Gaza. But there are pockets, in Burkina Faso where warnings have been issued. There have been pockets of Ethiopia in light of the drought conditions and very significant conflict that has impeded humanitarian access. But I think, again, one needs resources, one needs access, and that requires political will among all of us. So, yeah.
one of probably the most disturbing aspects of this Hamas attack on Israel has been the sexual violence against women. And I have to say this, also one of the most disturbing aspects of Putin's war in Ukraine has also been the sexual assault on women. And it seems like, people say, oh, well, this is always part of war. Well, it is not always. It's part of some wars, and some, obviously, military forces use sexual assault as a tool. But we can't just let it go with a shrug. And so my question is there anything in the budget on this particular subject of protecting or working with women in these conflict zones or after? I know Ukraine especially, this has been a very big issue.
Let me start by saying that it should never be greeted with a shrug. We should never get used to the weaponization of sexual violence. I started my career in Bosnia, where there were rape camps that had been set up to target Bosnian Muslim women primarily. And what Hamas did and the documentation of that is it's horrifying. And all of us should force ourselves to read these accounts. When I was in Israel last month, I traveled to Kibbutz Be'eri, where more than 100 people had been killed, and from where people were kidnapped and hostages have been taken. Again, we have to confront this, and we have to be there for survivors on the other side, no matter where this happens. Tigray is a place where there was rampant sexual violence as part of that war. You asked a question, we operate globally, but we operate country by country, and I'm happy to follow up with you and get you sort of what share of our humanitarian programming exists in this space. But I can't resist also coming back to the National Security Supplemental and how important it is, because you started your question by talking about food insecurity and the risk of famine. When you have people who are at risk of dying if they don't get access to rations, and the pie in which you are, and the number of crises and conflicts is increasing. I mean, a year ago when I last testified here, we didn't have the war in Gaza and we didn't have the war in Sudan. I mean, so the wars keep getting added to the ledger and unfortunately not getting taken away. So I worry that it is programming like this that is most likely to get cut. That is the psychosocial care and the GBV services to survivors. And so that is, again, if we can right-size our humanitarian assistance budget, just to even with the new wars, to just be flat with last year would allow us to do more of this kind of programming.
Mr. Chair, just what are the numbers in Sudan? What,
In terms of the food insecurity, well, in terms of the numbers who are IPC, the most extreme, I think it is 4 million people are in that sort of most extreme food insecurity category. But there, again, the issue is the two warring factions. We have commodities. The U.S. spent nearly $1 billion since the war began on humanitarian assistance, including $600 million from USAID. But the two men who have taken their country down the path of ruin are not allowing convoys to flow freely from one area to the next. This is, I recognize something, again, that is happening in other parts of the world as well, but we feel we could reach many more people if we can get more resources and if the political pressure on those leaders will allow those goods to flow.
Mr. Speaker, if I might say, and I thank you for your answer, I would call on these humanitarian protesters of the world to also raise their voices for what's happening in Sudan.
Let me associate myself with the words that you've been
Thank
mentioning.
you, and I yield.
Mr. Kroll, thank you again, and you've been patient, so thank you.
Thank you. Administrator Powers, thank you for being here with us today. It's always great to see you. Like last year, I want to start with the U.S. Merchant Marine Fleet. Cargo's preference law requires federal agencies to ship at least half of the taxpayers' financed cargo on U.S. flagged, U.S.-owned, U.S. crewed ships. U.S. flagged ships rely on Ship American cargo preference rules to stay afloat. And in the face of unfair competition from the Chinese and other subsidiary fleets, the flags of convenience, as they're referred to, that does not comply with the U.S. safety and environmental tax and wage laws. However, USDA's cargo preference compliance leaves much to be desired. In the recent years, USDA has only shipped about 30% of its cargo on U.S. flagged ships, while those vessels remain laid up and their mariners out of work. Please outline for me what USA can do to maximize its use of these U.S. flagged vessels over the coming year, consistent with its obligation under law.
Thank you. And thank you for returning to this important subject, which does have a great bearing on how quickly we are able to move commodities to people along the lines of what we've been describing. But not only that, as you note, given that the costs of freight come out of the overall cost of doing business for humanitarian assistance, it also has a bearing on how many people we are able to reach. So that these cargo preference questions are really material to USDA and to our work together. So as you know, we're required to ship 50% of our commodities on U.S. flagged ships. I think there are two issues. One, and I think your question got at this, but there aren't enough U.S. flagged ships in the program, and some of those ships are very old. And two, partly because of the other countries involved in this business that you mentioned, it is more expensive to ship on U.S. ships than on foreign flagged ships. Today, because the number of bulk vessels that are U.S. flagged is limited, today there are only 4 bulk vessels operating under U.S. flag. And maybe this is kind of what you were getting at, but last year USDA did not receive U.S. flag offers on 33% of our bulk cargo opportunities in FY 2023. So one suggestion, or and I have to be careful here because there are a lot of agencies involved in this matter, but one of the limiting factors to increasing bulk vessel availability, and I'm looking at you because you're more expert on this than I am, but is the statutory 3-year waiting period for joining the cargo preference program. And I think the Maritime Administration has raised concerns about this waiting period. The supply of vessels in the fleet, expanding that supply, maybe accelerating that process. This was also in a recent GAO report. That would at least put us in a position where maybe we could get more offers on the tenders that we are putting out. So, there are
Let me interrupt
trade-offs.
you there, because I met
Yeah.
with them yesterday, and they said there were 10 vessels.
Well, we can
We have access to.
circle back.
Not 3. And if it's a cost factor, remember, these are taxpayers' money, so we need to spend this money within our country if we can actually spend it.
Well, the good thing about the commodity program is we're spending it on U.S. food as well. So it's
but
a
all-
question of,
Yeah, but also the freight side too, because those ships are very important to us in war times. We need to keep them active. If it's hauling your freight and we have to pay a little bit more for it, that's okay. But in war times, when they're going to truly become so valuable, because they laid up many of those Liberty ships, many of these ships we're
Yeah.
talking about in Mobile, up the Mobile River, and as a child, I watched them get chopped up one at a time. There were hundreds. It was amazing how many ships there were, and we're down to 10 or 3, as you're saying. And I don't know where our numbers cross. I'm not
was
disputing
f-
yours. I'm just telling you what they're telling me
it was,
yesterday.
yeah. So I'd love to follow up with your team. I mean, what I was told, because
So is there any way we can make up that 30% we lost last year on this next year? In other words, shoot for an 80% versus 50?
Well, I think we have the 50% floor. I think the availability of ships is going to make a difference as to where we land altogether. So if you're right that there's 10, then we need to make sure that the other 6 are actually, the 6 that exist are part of the cargo preference program. I think this issue that has just come to my attention about the waiting period might be something that we can look at together. But again, bearing in mind that the whole enterprise is also about addressing, what is in my lifetime the greatest rates of malnutrition and hunger than we have seen. We want to make sure that in paying those higher costs, which granted, of course, go to Americans, that doesn't come at the expense of actually feeding the people that this program is also designed,
Well,
is
thank
above
you
all
for the,
designed
thank
to
you for the
support.
job you do. It doesn't go unnoticed, and
Thank you,
thank
sir.
you very much.
But let's
Mr. Chair-
please follow up and see what we can do together.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Carl, and you've been an amazing leader in this, so thank you. Thank you. Congresswoman Torres, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and I just want to say to you that I welcome a separate hearing with witnesses who are a bit more directly involved in the situation, such as the U.S. ambassador to the UN, so that we can continue to have a more informed conversation around what is happening in Israel and in Gaza. I know I was supposed to travel with you last year to the area, and I finally went as a member of Congress to Israel, and unfortunately, one of the sites that we were supposed to see at the northern Lebanon border, we were not able to reach because it got bombed just hours before we arrived. So the situation there is still very tense. And, we do need to have a conversation around that. Administrator Power, I'm going to go into the area of my expertise and, my interest in the last 10 years since I've been in Congress. I'm tired of everything that has been happening with the sad, issues of our children on our southern border, suffering from these hard leaders, for lack of a better word, in the Northern Triangle that are continue to push this population north. Most of them are indigenous populations, not to mention the issue of drugs coming into the U.S., being pushed by former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez. So, enough is enough. Where are the opportunities for true partnership in the region, and how will U.S. aid ensure its programs in a Northern Triangle are effectively helping the people that we intend to help, which also includes working with nonprofit organizations directly in the region, that we are not telling them how to run their lives. I think that they know how to do that, and they know where to create opportunities for themselves. They just need an opportunity for support, not only from us, but from their own governments, most of all.
Well, Congresswoman, thank you, and I was just with Ambassador Thomas Greenfield earlier. I'll tell her you're interested in hearing from her as well, and I know she's due up here, I think, in May. But I do hope that we can bring a field perspective as well, just on the basis of all of the partners that we are supporting on the ground who are doing such brave work in Gaza. I think you and I had the chance to travel to one of the opportunities, which is Guatemala, where in an upset victory that very few expected, a person who ran on a platform of fighting corruption and reforming the politics and the economy of the country was, because of the engagement of young people and indigenous people, was elected. And I think we have learned a lot from democratic backsliding over the last 20 years, not just in the hemisphere, but around the world. And one of the lessons that we've learned is the importance of taking advantage of democratic openings, because they are so fleeting and sadly increasingly rare. So what we have sought to do is, as you know, work with the Arevalo team in transition, very specifically on the anti-corruption agenda that he has brought forward. We've heard from the private sector in the U.S. their excitement about engaging in Guatemala. I think the Vice President's initiative, the Partnership for Central America, has shown the return on the administration and the Congress's engagement with American companies to look at Northern Central America.
I have like 50 seconds. I'm going to stop you for a minute.
sorry.
Just to include that I hope that we can find those same type of opportunities in Honduras. You know, there's been a lot of developments in recent months in Honduras, and I think that that is another area that we are seeing backsliding, and we cannot take our attention from the region. In the last 25 seconds that I have, I want to chime in on my great concern for Sudan and South Sudan. I was there 2 years ago. At the onset of the Russian war on Ukraine, most of that grain was locked up and couldn't leave the region. I think I was texting you and everyone else that I could while in the region. I've never seen babies. At the time, I had a 1-year-old grandson, and I saw a 5-year-old there that looked the same size as my grandson. And it was heartbreaking as a grandma. I don't want to see that either. So the rainy season is coming again. No one is talking about how do we do airlifts. I know the Mongolian government, when I was there, was present in providing some security to the women in the region and providing some food assistance, deliveries. So I hope to be able to get an update, a longer update from your office as to what more can we do from the committee to focus our attention on that.
I'd just say one thing in brief, which is first to thank Congresswoman Lee for, I think, traveling with Senator Booker and Congresswoman Jacobs to the Sudan-Chad border, and others. I think it was Congresswoman Frankel mentioned the paucity of attention to the food conditions in Sudan, which, as we've discussed, are horrific. There are also nearly, I mean, again, you're better to speak to this more recently than me, but I was there last year, nearly 1 million refugees from Sudan in Chad. And that makes Chad the 5th largest refugee hosting country in the world, but it has nothing to fall back on to house those people. And those are the lucky ones who got out of Darfur and got across the border. So Chad itself is facing a state of emergency for food insecurity, and now these communities are being asked to welcome people coming across. So brings us back again to the importance of the National Security Supplemental, the fact that that is a misnomer, and that we would just ask the House to put us in a position at least to have the same resources we had last year, even though needs are spiraling, instead of having a 40% cut.
Thank you. Mr. Turner, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Administrator Power, for being here today. Malnutrition is the #1 cause of child deaths globally and is responsible for 3 million child deaths annually. The deadliest form of malnutrition, known as wasting, when the body becomes so starved of nutrients that it begins to consume itself, is responsible for 1 million child deaths each year. For children suffering from wasting, ordinary food alone is not enough to bring them back in many cases. Although life-saving solutions exist, historically, less than 1 in 4 wasted children have access to treatment. Without treatment, many of them will die. Ready-to-use therapeutic food, which the ranking member of the full committee mentioned in her opening statement, or RUTF, a simple medical food paste made of peanuts, powdered milk, vegetable oils, soy, sugar, and multivitamins, is the global standard treatment for severe wasting. Over a 6-week term of treatment with RUTF, children are able to gain weight and be brought back from the edge of death. In 2022, the United States, alongside Canada, Ireland, and the Netherlands, and the UK, and private philanthropy, made a historic commitment to over $500 million to produce and deliver RUTF to treat millions of wasted children. This U.S. leadership increased global RUTF coverage rates in 2023 by over 40%. And for the first time in history, a majority of the world's severely malnourished children had access to these simple life-saving products. So, Administrator, with the remarkable success we've seen over the last 18 months, substantially increasing treatment coverage for millions of children, can you please update us on USAID's plan to maintain scaled-up procurement of American-made RUTF, and tell us what you need from Congress to continue these critical life-saving efforts?
Thank you, and thank you for referencing the effort that we made to leverage what were called the Ukraine supplementals, but because of the flexibility and the humanity of people up here, they were actually written very broadly and had a profound impact on fighting malnutrition and food insecurity in the global south over the last 2 years. So by writing those supplementals broadly, we had additional resources. We then, as you said, made an announcement, issued a challenge that we would use some of those additional resources to make an unprecedented investment in the purchase of RUTF in order to provide that to World Food Program and UNICEF, and then we called on other countries to do the same, and they stepped up with several $100 million worth of commitment. We do not have anything comparable happening this year. The pipeline still from those investments is flowing, which is really important, and we are certainly making significant investments in RUTF for the reasons that you describe, and the reasons that we've been discussing about the number of places that have kids under 5 who need this miracle paste. And credit those American companies who have gotten into this business and are producing at scale. Unfortunately, my answers, I'm a little bit repetitive today, and I don't mean to be, but we need the National Security Supplemental. We just need it. It has in it the resources that would allow us at least to have the same humanitarian budget roughly that we had last year, and even though needs are up because of Sudan and Gaza way more this year, that would allow us to make more substantial investments. One of the things that was really great about the challenge that we issued to other countries to step on RUTF and the big pledge, the unprecedented pledge that you referenced that we made, is that it allowed some of the American companies to get their production cycles going and really to produce at scale, knowing that those purchases were going to be made. The way it's happened, as I understand it, I'm not
Were
an
you able to
expert.
see cost reductions as a result of that? Because it's about $1 a day for the
Yes,
treatment.
I mean,
for
I would presume in bulk, we should have, but I don't know that. We'd have to get back to you on that. But if we can have some predictability and the infusion of resources that would just keep us flat with last year, we would be in a position again to give that kind of notice to those companies that would allow them to know that there will be a market for the production that they do, because bottlenecks apparently have been a major issue or delayed supply chains when it comes to RUTF in the past.
Currently, there are over 20 U.S. government agencies engaged in our foreign assistance efforts, including USAID, State, MCC, DFC, Treasury, Commerce, Agriculture, Justice, and DHS. While funding decisions are intended to be made by ambassadors at each post, the programming decisions tend to be made here in Washington. What are you doing at USAID to ensure that these efforts are coordinated across agencies and aligned with our national security and diplomatic objectives, like countering the Chinese Communist Party, for example?
Yeah, well, I think, actually, it's a great example. I think the Global Infrastructure Initiative is an example of where the NSC role in coordinating and bringing all those agencies together is extremely important around global infrastructure. USAID's share of that is catalytic. It's often regulatory, or it's, taking our food security programs and making sure that the beneficiaries, for example, can benefit from the Libido Railroad as it gets built. We might do a public-private partnership with the Angolan Ministry of Transportation so that they can get other transportation concessions going. So that's our slice of it, but the DFC might be making the much more substantial investments. So I think the NSC has a critical role to play. I would say Feed the Future, our food security program, is another area where USDA, MCC, DFC, all have, State Department, of course, have active programming. There, I'm the chair of the Feed the Future board, and we bring the other agencies together around our shared agricultural food security agenda, including research investments that we and USDA and others are making domestically to make sure we're benefiting from the best minds of the United States in adapting to changing weather and the like.
I appreciate your answer on that, and I look forward to having further discussions with you specifically about RUTF. 'Cause I
I'd
think-
welcome that.
I know your leadership on that has been great. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Meng, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Lee. Thank you, Administrator Power, for being here. I wanted to ask about the budget request for USAID for fiscal year 2025, which assumes that Congress will provide supplemental funding. Earlier this week, I had the privilege of meeting with Ukrainian Ambassador Markarova. We spoke about how, as you know, almost 90% of the Ukrainians who have fled have been women and children. Last year, Representatives Franco, Houlihan, and I sent a bipartisan letter asking that your agency, which is doing great work on the ground in Ukraine and surrounding countries, prioritize the needs of women and girls in humanitarian funding and assistance strategies to address gender-based violence. Administrator Power, I want to thank you for the resources that your agency has dedicated to women and girls in crisis, especially through the Safe from the Start program. Broadly speaking, how is USAID continuing to respond to the Ukraine crisis, and how would a lack of supplemental funding affect your ongoing response in Ukraine and around the world? Furthermore, can you also speak to how USAID and partners are addressing gender-based violence in Ukraine and host countries?
Well, thank you. I'm glad this is a topic that is getting more attention than it often does today. Maybe I would just note, beyond what I've said already in response to Congresswoman Frankel's comments, that in Ukraine, again, thanks to the resources that we were able to invest in two broad domains, humanitarian emergency response and development assistance, we've been able to do an awful lot. Everything from hotlines to prevent sexual trafficking, which was a major issue as those refugees poured into Eastern Europe when the war began and have continued to flow with Putin's escalation in recent weeks. Gender-based violence care, psychosocial support, also support for alerts so that people know their rights, and we try to chip away at the stigma around sexual violence, because in the first wave of the invasion during the occupation of Ukrainian territories from which Russian forces were ultimately repelled in many places, so many women came out of that, not only having suffered unimaginable rape and sexual imprisonment and torture, but also feeling in their communities that they couldn't talk about it. And I will say President Zelensky and Madam Zelensky have done a really good job trying to destigmatize and really make clear who's at fault in horrors of that nature. So, but you asked about the stakes of the supplemental, and all roads, on emergency response of this nature lead back to the $9 billion in the Senate passed national security supplemental, a package that passed with more than 20 Republican senators supporting it. But we have been able to spend $210 million broadly in Ukraine on programming that touches GBV, sexual trafficking, the rights of persons with disabilities, attacks on LGBTQI plus people. 10% of our so-called DART budget. Those resources are just not available to us. The supplemental contains a request very specific to Ukraine for more than $1 billion for humanitarian assistance. As I've said, with needs up, we're down 40% from where we were last year in humanitarian assistance, and these kinds of programs are going to pay a terrible price.
I yield back.
Mr. Subcommittee, again, I said it before, I'll say it again, I'm honored and thrilled that you are on this subcommittee, and now the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Happy to be part of this committee for a lot of reasons. I'm very passionate about the issues here, very interested in learning more. Welcome, Administrator Power. Thank you for being here. But also, one of my predecessors, Jim Colby, served on this committee for a long time, and as chairman as well. So following in his footsteps is a great honor of mine. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, Administrator Power, as the new guy here, I'm going to like to talk about an issue that is the forefront of what my constituents in Arizona are facing, and that's a migration crisis. And living at the border in a border district and now representing one in Congress, I understand the migration ebbs and flows. I'm an immigrant myself, so I understand it on a more personal basis than most. However, since the administration took office, it seems like every month one historic record is broken after another, and for the wrong reasons, the wrong way, basically, the wrong direction. What we're seeing now is not only a humanitarian crisis, but also an unsustainable long-term one of having a dire impact in our border communities in terms of the humanitarian impact of this crisis. I see in your budget request, you're requesting an 84% increase in targeted funding to address irregular migration. So knowing that USAID's request related to migration efforts is based, or at least partly in this case, on the assumption of how many migrants the administration expects to migrate, what kind of numbers are anticipated this year?
With respect, that kind of question I think is better oriented toward CBP or toward DHS.
Well, you're requesting the increase in funding here, which I'm
in order
assuming
to
is...
prevent the migration. We're trying to prevent it and address root causes in the communities in question. I'm happy to elaborate, but go ahead.
Sure, yes, please. That's my follow-up on that. So how, because what I'm trying to, reason here or come to a conclusion is, if there's an increase in this, that means that we're maybe expecting a higher number, or you're preparing for a higher number. And if that's the case, what are you preparing for? Or the increased funding, you're trying to maybe stop it or redirect it. So what's the expectation here in terms of the encounters that we're going to probably see from what you're seeing, and where this funding would go to alleviate or tackle that issue?
So, okay, I'll try, but again, we're working, the place where we have done what we're asking for resources to do more of is Northern Central America, more than any other place in the hemisphere, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And the work, and we'd be happy, especially if you want to dig into this, to drill into this, because there's a little time, but these are everything from, doing citizen security, INL at the State Department, working with police, because gangs and the terror they're inflicting on people cause people as one source of migration, economic despair, of course, another one. So drawing private sector investment, the kind of anti-corruption work I was talking about sooner to create more jobs, that's very important. But I'd flag two other aspects of what USAID is doing that might be of interest. There's a huge amount of migration also within South America. And if migrants can be regularized if, for example, their degrees, Venezuelan migrants in Peru, if their degrees are accredited in Peru, and if they are regularized and able to work and send their kids to school in Peru, they're much less likely to come north. So we work a lot with the Colombian government, the Peruvian government, the Brazilian government, in a support role to help them provide services to migrants. And if you actually look at apprehensions at the border of Venezuelans who have come via Colombia, almost none of them got status in Colombia. Almost none of them were regularized. What we're finding is that regularization in the countries en route is a mitigant. Now, the numbers are the numbers. I'm not pretending they're a panacea, that they speak for themselves. The other thing we're doing, if I may, because it's an unprecedented investment that USAID has made, is in lawful pathways and the H-2 program. We've actually managed to triple the number of seasonal work visas given to people in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras.
Well, and let me, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead. No, of course.
I'm my first meeting, and I don't want to go over on my first opportunity here on the time. So I'll ask, just okay, seems like this is a friendlier committee on the clock, which I really appreciate that. So
That makes one of us.
Just,
just in the first round, I know, and that's probably not to your advantage. So I'm still not going to push more on this, but I do want to, I am as interested as anyone else, and probably more than anyone else, to reduce that flow. So when I see an 84% increase on this effort in terms of where the taxpayer dollars are going to go, I want to make sure that they are being used for the purpose of meeting the objective here of reducing whatever number of flow we're seeing up on the border. We're completely overwhelmed. And when you talk about this being prioritized on those with education visas or degrees that may have a different path or a different option, I think that's one way to do this. But again, what I want to make sure here, and I want to dig deeper into this. Again, I'm new to this conversation, so I want to make sure that I understand it better. Is making sure that this pretty high increase in funding on this is going to be used with an ultimate purpose of somehow impacting this crisis that my constituents see at the border every single day.
Well, if I can respond just in brief, the causality is challenging. And what I'd love to walk you through is the metrics that we do have, which are, I don't pretend are perfect science, but we and DHS do intention to migrate surveys. And of course, we look at apprehensions and what the rates in particular countries are going up or down. And again, without making grand claims about causality and relating them to USAID's work, I think it is noteworthy that the total number of border encounters for people from Northern Central America, where we've made these investments in addressing root causes of migration, fell by a third between FY21 and FY23. There is an uptick in 24, so I want to concede that, but far less than the other countries of outmigration in the hemisphere. So that's at least worth looking at. And I think if you look at the H-2 program, what we see is when people, throw their hat in the ring to be eligible to work on an American farm or in the hospitality business or in landscaping or whatever, their intentions to migrate plummet as well. They put themselves in the mix to try to get access to a lawful pathway, because that's the best of all worlds for them, because as you know well, so many would much prefer to stay in their home community and have livelihoods and safety. And the H-2 program really, and H-2A is uncapped, and I think there's a lot more potential to go to countries of high outmigration and to grow that program further. And we have established proof of concept, as Congresswoman Torres saw in Guatemala on our visit, that small investments in the labor ministries in advertising these programs and in the vetting to make sure that American companies are getting what they need have outsized benefits. But to scale it to address the large migration numbers, that's going to take time.
We'd love to dig deeper with on that issue with you. Mr. Chairman, thank you for indulging me a little more time.
no, on the contrary, Mr. Subcommittee, so the ranking member and I were talking about, and if we'll do a second round. Thank you also. We purposely have left it very open so that we could get these discussions going. But in the second round, what we're going to do is we're going to hold it to 4 minutes, and we're going to keep people to 4 minutes. So everybody is pre-warned, forewarned, and I'll try to do that myself. So we'll start the clock even with me if we may. Madam Administrator, nobody truly believes that in the near future, the entire world will be predominantly using coal plants to generate most, if not all of its electricity. I think that's a given, that's not going to be the case. So I'm actually confused about USAID's using what is an outdated extreme emission scenario called this RCP 8.5 in the modeling. In your modeling, that overstates the likelihood of extreme weather events in 100 years, including on relying on assumptions such as that the predominant use of coal for electricity is that the coal is going to be the predominant use for electricity generation globally. And again, so it really begs the question: how many other USAID programs are compromised by what are really discredited and outdated climate assumptions? You and I have had some conversations, and I'm greatly appreciative of, as I mentioned before, that you've always been very open. Look, for example, you know my deep concerns about the direction this administration has taken on the Power Africa program, seeking to meet the administration's climate change commitments at the expense of Africa's need for large-scale industrial power generation, which, by the way, then keeps poor Africans, literally in the dark, which is hard to understand. So is USAID using these outdated and, frankly, if it wasn't so sad, laughable climate models to justify a carbon-free shift in Power Africa?
Stipulate we are not using laughable models, but I think that the all-of-the-above approach that we take does emphasize, there's been a lot of stress today on value for money and cost effectiveness. We are very interested in helping communities and countries electrify with least cost energy sector planning. And that doesn't rule out, for example, something you and I have had an exchange on in the past, the use of natural gas, if that's needed to stabilize energy sources. But we are compliant with the Electrify Africa Act. We are taking our cues from the market and where we can get best buy. A lot of the communities in Africa, because you mentioned Power Africa, aren't soon going to be able to connect to national grids. And so if you want to do pop-up electricity at a rural health clinic, often solar is the best way, to put yourself in a position to do off-grid electrification. But please rest assured that energy poverty is something that is the driving imperative of ending energy poverty. And the fact that 200 million people, thanks to Power Africa, have either first-time access to electricity or improved access to electricity because of Power Africa, I think speaks to our ability to use quite modest resources if you think about the good that is done and the collateral benefits to development of having electricity. You can see that we are, in fact, again, pursuing all tools, but as the price of solar and wind have come way down, the demand signals that we get definitely take us in those directions in many communities.
And I will continue to work with you on that. We all know, as you know, that under any scenario, even outdated ones, Africa's emissions have no measurable impact at all on the climate. But I'm almost
Cost is something that matters a great deal.
It does, absolutely, absolutely. So you saw that, Madam Ranking Member? 4 seconds under my time. You are recognized.
I'll take those 4 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me just say thank you to members who are raising the issue of Chad and Sudan. When I was there, I was reminded that in Chad's one of the poorest countries in the world, first of all. Secondly, that the last congressional delegation which visited Chad was, I believe, in 2009, 2010. So I would encourage members as we put together CODELs to visit Chad, because when you look at what's taking place and how Chad is taking care of these refugees, it's a lessons learned. 70% are women and children coming from Sudan, fleeing violence. The men are being slaughtered as they attempt to leave. And in fact, we're talking about people, and I visited Darfur many times in the early 2000s, Some of these refugees were children in Darfur in a refugee camp who are now have fled to Chad in a refugee camp. So it's a disaster of unspeakable proportions. So I hope the press picks up this and reports more on what is taking place in Sudan and Chad, and encourage not only the humanitarian assistance, but push harder for a diplomatic resolve and a ceasefire. On the Caribbean, Madam Ambassador, you know, we've been pushing hard to create a better partnership with the people of the Caribbean. How do we better demonstrate that the United States values their partnership? I also was recently down in the Caribbean, and believe you me, China is, as you know, everywhere in the Caribbean. And many of the countries, most of the countries are designated as middle-income countries when we know that they're very poor for the most part. The climate crisis is wreaking havoc on the islands. There are barriers to assistance and financing to better combat the effects of climate. And so the 12 million that we set aside recently to promote more inclusive growth in the Caribbean, wonder how that's working. Have we engaged a little bit more? Have we engaged more with people of the Caribbean and governments of the Caribbean? And finally, I'll just say there's one ambassador in Barbados who has, I believe he has 6 or 7 islands with no airplane. Has to fly it to Miami or New York, USAID. I mean, so what kind of message does that send in terms of importance of these small island nations who are great partners for the United States, but who we still haven't seen as valued appropriately?
Well, I mean, you've been on this case for many, many years. I always hesitate to look back and see just how long you've been pushing us in a direction, but I hope you see that it's really making a difference. I mean, it is the way this administration has engaged the Caribbean, I think, is unlike any that I have seen, including Vice President Harris's engagement with CARICOM, our diplomats' most recent engagement with CARICOM diplomatically around Haiti and transition. But in terms of resources where you've placed a lot of emphasis, USAID has expanded our footprint, something you've been asking for a long time, to 2 new field offices in Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago. At FY21, we were at just 18 million for, again, countries and communities with great needs. We're up in FY23, we're up to about 45 million. It's, again, very small compared to the work we could be doing in economic growth, in health, in disease surveillance and the like. What I find exciting, and this gets to, again, this larger culture of leveraging that we're building, is small investments that USAID is making to unlock greater pools of resources. So we supported the establishment of the Blue-Green Bank with the government of Barbados. That was just a $5 million contribution. It's going to be leveraged for hundreds of millions of dollars. We worked with the governments to help them access Green Climate Fund money. That's something that's a work in progress. Green Climate Fund, has a lot of resources coming in from all over the world, but small island states who are the most vulnerable to climate change's ravages have been the least able to compete and submit proposals, project-ready proposals. And so that's, I think, a niche that USAID can help when it comes to climate adaptation and resilience, which these countries need desperately. And then we've just launched a new resilience fund with the CARICOM Development Fund. We provided just $1.75 million, again, not small money, but that's being leveraged to develop a fund that will have a target investment of around $100 million. So I think again, we'll grow our budget, grow our footprint, hopefully get the ambassador a plane, although Miami is said to be, Chairman says, nice place to come through, but that we need an ability to access these communities and show with our presence a presence that can then also translate into drawing more private sector investment, because as the ambassador and our teams get around and expand our eyes and ears on the ground, we're better able then to latch up and to matchmake with people here in North America, in the United States.
Thank you. You didn't take too much more than the 4 seconds that you got from me.
Thank you for the 5 seconds I got from you.
There
Appreciate
you
it.
go. The distinguished ranking member of the full committee.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Just two or three things. I just wanted, Mr. LeTurner is not here, just have a question of RUTF. It's my understanding, and this is from USDA Director, that RUTF is a commodity. And I don't know if you've had any conversations with Secretary Vilsack about the use of the CCC, the Commodity Credit Corporation, for the use of funds for RUTF. Again, it is a commodity, so labeled, so it falls within their jurisdiction. The other piece is the use of Title II. So I'm just thinking, what are there other avenues or vehicles that we can use to deal with RUTF and bring it up to scale, given its ability to avert, hunger and wasting? So,
On the CCC,
Yeah.
I will take that. I think, we're incredibly grateful to American farmers for stepping up and to Secretary Vilsack and his team for stepping up in this way. We are working aggressively to try to, because of the lead time that is needed to get food from here to communities in Yemen, in Ethiopia,
right.
in Somalia, in Gaza, who are facing needs in the here and now. We're hoping, again, to accelerate efforts to get that food out in the world. I think it's a really interesting idea.
Yeah,
I don't know what already is in the pipeline from USDA. We're the distributors out in the world, and USDA is the procurer of those resources, so it's something I can follow up with Secretary Vilsack.
and with Title II as well.
Yeah. On that, I'm not going to come back to the supplemental again, but
I get it. You don't have to.
but I think,
Please.
and it's, yes, I'm not sure exactly how to be responsive to that part of your question, but.
Okay. Quickly, I know, and I have to reflect that the budget for this year is just 3 weeks old here, that we just 3 weeks ago, we got a budget. But in the language we agreed to in conference, and I just want to put this on your radar again. We've talked about this, the tracking of funding for children and youth. And what we talked about is looking at benefiting infants and other children under school age. And the language talks about not later than 90 days after the date of enactment, you would submit a report to the appropriate committees on steps taken to improve the tracking and the disaggregation of funding that benefits children and youth. Primary, secondary efforts. There's a lot of information of older kids, but looking at what's happening overall to infants and children and so forth. So again, I want to put that on your radar screen to really help us to take a look at, if that's.
It's a lot to process, and we've been focused very much on the dollar amounts and some of the oversight provisions. I was actually not tracking that new requirement, so I've always appreciated your
I know your
focus
plate
on this
is
pool of
more
people.
than full. The
Yeah.
cup runneth over.
But those individuals are the future, and
Right.
when they're not well-nourished in under 2 or under 5, that has consequences developmentally for the rest of their lives.
I know I only have 11 seconds and the chair is going to kill me. But there was a report, and I think, and we can talk about this offline, the 2023 Annual Employee Survey within USAID. And I know that you're dealing with looking for more personnel as well. But my understanding, and I want to talk to you offline, is that there's a question within the workforce about communication from management, about their input into decision-making, and we're looking at decreased rates of employee satisfaction. I just say that to you, and in terms of looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, et cetera. A serious issue, which I would look forward to talking with you about, because there are staffing challenges, and how can we deal with that programmatically? Because obviously, especially for the portfolio that you have, you got to have folks who feel they're supported, they're valued, and that every ounce of their fiber is focused on the mission that you're all entrusted with.
Well, let me just say a couple things briefly. First of all, I can't tell you how much it means to the team when I come and do these hearings, as I've done this week, and so many members from both sides of the aisle emphasize the great work that USAID is doing. You would think that, maybe these are just idle comments that fall by the wayside, but the number of times they get played back and the number of people who are actually listening and hearing this in a bipartisan way, it just, it means a great deal. And I also, just feel so privileged that I've had the chance to come back into public service and work with these people who are just extraordinary and innovators. I mean, every day, USAID's toolkit to address the world's biggest challenges gets bigger because they're experimenting and they're iterating and they're curious and they're listening and they're trying to work with more local partners. I'm grateful that in a very tough FY24 budget, that while everything is cut, that operating expenses were cut the least. I think it's around a 3% cut. It's, again, it would be really much better if there were no cut there. You're right about morale. We look at those surveys really, really carefully. My best understanding, but very much open to feedback, is our program budget has grown over recent years, I think the last 5 years, by 68% because of the needs of the world. And our operating expenses have grown by 27%. I talked earlier about contracting officers and what they are subjected to in terms of their workload relative to that of their DoD counterpart. I think it's almost 4 to 1 how much money a USAID contracting officer is processing versus their DoD counterpart. We're trying to address that, but I do think, building a more representative and diverse workforce, we've made great strides on. Had a lot of conversations with many of you about that, but we need to right-size our workforce and also make sure that they have the skills, as AI and technology, private sector partnership, climate adaptation, whatever the disagreements about climate change, which I hope we can get past. Nobody disagrees that most of the countries in which we work are, agriculturally especially, getting ravaged by the effects of hotter weather. And so the skill set for our teams, making them feel like they have the confidence to go out there and again, build the multi-sectoral partnerships that are needed to solve these problems. I think the world is affecting the state of morale, probably for many of you, and certainly at USAID, people come because they want to change the world. They want to make the world better.
Administrator, I am gonna.
He's going to cut me off.
Yeah.
But you can't do more with less. And I thank you, I beg your
No.
indulgence.
I hate cutting off
we
the
can do
full
more with
committee
more.
ranking member. I hate
You can
doing
do
that.
more with more.
We can definitely do a
Yeah.
lot more with more.
But every family in the United States and every business has to also understand that we have a fiscal responsibility. We have a debt that's unsustainable. We have to do better, and we should be doing better with we need to do more. We can't ask the American people to do more with less, and then the federal government continue to do less with more. But anyways, everybody has been very generous. We've gone a little bit over the time. Mr. Subcommittee, you are recognized.
Gosh, the only thing keeping everybody here is the new guy. Why don't I just go right to it real quick here? I just came back from Israel on Monday. An amazing once in a, just a great opportunity in so many ways. You can't summarize it in just even an hour conversation, even less than just a few minutes. So you can imagine all that I learned and the sites that I visited. One of the things that were discussed, obviously, is the aid to the war zone on the Gaza Strip side of things. So when we look at the aid that is not reaching the civilian population there, what have you seen as the reason for that? Where is it being stopped? Is any of this going to actually part of the Hamas militia in terms of intercepting this? I want to learn more about, from your perspective, what's happening there.
Thank you so much. Well, I think, for starters, in the wake of October 7th and the horrific attacks and kidnappings, There was a great reluctance on the part of the Israeli government to allow significant amounts of food and dual-use items like fuel, which is necessary for food to get delivered. Gradually, over the last 6 months, things have opened up. President Biden's been very engaged with Prime Minister Netanyahu, but not enough food is being allowed to cross. And that's a combination of the number of hours that people were keeping at various checkpoints, initially just too few points of entry, restrictions on items, and an elaborate, again, understandably, a lot of vigilance after October 7th about anything that would go in, but an elaborate scanning process that slowed things down. Then on the other side, as the food diminished, because prior to October 7th, as you've probably heard, about 500 trucks, commercial and humanitarian trucks, were going into Gaza each day. When that plummeted initially to zero and then gradually got back up, and in the pause, went up fairly substantially, but then went back down. And, even as recently as a month ago, at times was, under 150 trucks, combined with all the destruction of the markets and the granaries and the arable land, and people's own personal stockpiles, that wasn't making up, we weren't getting close to that 500 truck number. This week, for the first time, more than 400 trucks are going in. That's the first time we've ever hit numbers like that. But we have a ton of catch up to do. And if we are to catch up, it is absolutely essential that the flour that is still stuck in or at least was when I last looked, in Ashdod port, that make its way into Gaza, that there be a crossing into the north from Eretz that for a long time the government of Israel was reluctant to open, again, in light of what had happened, but that had the effect, again, limiting what can go in, and that a very substantial corridor as well be built from Jordan, where we think we can help build a kind of humanitarian hub where there is better prioritization of items, especially food and medical items, so that the right items go in.
Is there any speculation, or have you seen this happen, that Hamas is actually the one organizing, distributing, or managing where this aid goes? Because that's a high concern that I have, that I heard over and over again as I was in Israel, of that notion of Hamas controlling some of this and them actually starving their own people on this. That's a high concern for me, of where this aid and how it's not making it there. And if I look at Hamas's history of how they treat their own people, that would have been in line with everything else that they've done to the Palestinians. So in terms of the aid going to civilians and women and children, that's the intended purpose of that, has Hamas been intercepting or involved in any kind of that activity?
So I'd say three things. First, Hamas doesn't care about its people. Hamas has used its people as human shields.
Yeah.
We have every reason to be vigilant about Hamas and how it would act in these circumstances. I do think Hamas fighters are very much on the run and not in the position that they might be to organize some systematic scheme in light of the war. But the second thing I'd say is just we have a good sense, as does Israel, about what is going in and how much is going in. And we have a good sense of how much is needed. And there is a huge gap between what is needed and what is actually crossing the border from Israel into the Gaza Strip. So and the third thing I would say is that we do not have reports, and we're not just working willy-nilly with new partners. We're drawing on established relationships with the World Food Program, with UNICEF, with Save the Children, with the International Medical Corps, and we are not getting those reports of Hamas-directed diversion or absconding. There have been lootings, when particularly because the shortages are so great in the north, it's been very hard for some of the convoys even to move through civilians who are so desperate. They're so afraid that the convoy is going to be the last one that they see, that they, are grabbing what they can and stopping trucks in harm's way. We are hopeful, if we can continue to get the number of trucks way up even beyond where we are this week, that you will start to see more of a regularization. But that also requires aid workers and civilians being safe to access humanitarian supplies. So that also requires a much better deconfliction system than the one that has been in place so far. But we're happy to go into the details of what we know and then also where our information gaps are. But we're in very close touch with COGAT and with the IDF to hear from them. When if they have reports of things that are concerning them, they come right to the United States, given that we are one of the largest providers.
Thank you. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Frankel,
Thank you.
they did call votes, but we've actually,
well, I'm
believe it or
gonna
not,
be-
no, believe
I'm
it or
gonna
not,
keep my
even though we've
format.
had all this
Okay.
flexibility,
Well,
the timing is working out, so you are recognized.
Mr. Chair, you know I can't leave here without my three my's.
My.
I was wondering when they were coming.
Okay, so I just want to advocate, you've heard this before, for the women of the world to have full access to the health care they need, to make their own reproductive decisions. And I know there is an issue that we can agree on, Mr. Chair, even though we don't agree on abortion. And that is combating female genital mutilation. The statistics are shocking. I've read all different ones, but it's believed that there could be up to 230 million women survivors right now, and that another 60 million in the next 15 years. And so, look, I know we all agree it's a cruel practice. It has lots of consequences, physical and emotional. So, Madam Administrator, can you tell us what we can do to help you? Because I know that USAID does not like this practice either. But what can Congress do to help you combat female genital mutilation?
Well, let me just say that notwithstanding all of the awareness raising and resourcing of program that you personally and that Congress has done, we saw UNICEF's report, and I'm sure you saw this as well, that the 230 million that you cite is a 30 million person girl increase over the last 8 years. Now, that is primarily due to population growth, but that's of little consolation to every one of those girls and young women. So the pace of decline is apparently going to have to increase 27 times the pace of decline in terms of normative advances and enforcement of laws that are on the books if we are to end this practice, as had been our hope, by 2030. I would also note the Gambia right now, which is contemplating repealing the ban. So talk about going backwards, and that is just heartbreaking to contemplate. So, we are seeing leadership by clerics, faith leaders, communities, but often the loudest voices are coming from elsewhere. So, I think it's important, the funding and the resources that you have provided for this vital cause. Our work, I think UNICEF is doing a great job in the countries in which it is working. What is most important is local voices, local organizations, that the indigenous movements themselves get strength, and that is those voices are the most legitimate, obviously, in changing hearts and minds. So I think, again, recent news is a wake-up call that, as is the new UNICEF study, that there's more that has to be done. But really thinking, where is the leadership going to come from within the countries in which these populations are growing, and the practice is, because of those growing populations, spreading, notwithstanding sometimes laws on the books. So that's behind-the-scenes diplomacy, and it's resources for organizations risking a lot to lead on these questions.
Thank you, and thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, I hope that as we get through this budget process here, that we can take some time, maybe have a hearing. We talked about on sexual violence against women, including this practice and including this as tools of war. We could have a hearing at some point.
Let me first thank you for your leadership on this, and we'll obviously work together and figure out if we can find the time and everything else, because it is a hugely important issue. So, obviously, members may submit additional questions for the record. Madam Administrator, let me thank you for your time. As you can see, and purposely, and again, you've also been very generous with your time. There's so much interest in these issues, and as you can see, if we allowed it, we would still be here for the next 2 or 3 hours. And thank you for your patience. Thank you for allowing the chair to have this flexibility with the members. With that, this concludes today's hearing, and so the Subcommittee on Foreign Operations and Related Programs stands adjourned.